Hello, today we're going to be talking about Civilization's Inferno, the Rise and Reform of Industrial Cities, Chapter 19, the years 1880 to 1917. Now, to begin with, these cities are going to start to take shape. They're going to start to be established. We're talking big cities like New York and Chicago and Boston, maybe even a little bit into Los Angeles and some other things, some of these major cities. But cities became sites for manufacturing as well as finance and trade. There was a big push between, or a change between going rural, living outside the big cities, to moving urban, moving into these big cities. And the big push and the big change that caused that was steam engines and what they could accomplish with them, specifically in factories and different things. You started to get cable cars in the 1870s. In 1887, you had an electric trolley system. Think of like a modern day subway or trains. We don't necessarily have them here in Las Vegas, but they are elsewhere. You also started to get skyscrapers. Now, how the skyscraper was able to be built were steel girders, durable plate glass, and elevators. So they have a very strong structure on the outside that helps them to be built up very, very tall. The glass is stronger, and ultimately elevators. And in order for elevators to work, you're going to need electricity. And with the invention of electricity and the implementation and the rollout of electricity into cities, these things could happen. Between the 1870s, they started to switch from gas lamps, which were very dim and not very as efficient, to electrical lamps. Think of light bulbs like we use today. Here we can see a picture of some skyscrapers. Here we can see a picture of a steam engine locomotive, and then there on the right is a trolley car or a cable car, and this one's out of a modern day picture out of San Francisco, but the idea is still the same. Now in these cities, new people were coming. People relocated from rural to the urban because of this idea of industrialization, these factories and different things, and they weren't needed as much on farms anymore because farms were able to produce more with the invention of technology and different things. And so the daughters and the sons didn't necessarily need to stay at home, work on the farm. They could move elsewhere and be able to get jobs. You also had a lot of immigrants coming from other countries, from Asia, but predominantly from Europe. And the ones from Europe were coming to Ellis Island in the year 1892. Now, many of these immigrants would, what's known as ethnic clustering. They would kind of tend to live together and work in the same areas and shop in the same areas. Some of it was because of discrimination. They were forced out of certain areas and forced into other areas. But some of it was straight desire. They had a desire to stay with their people that they had lived with and spoke a common language with and ate common foods and those types of things. So they would set up stores and banks and newspapers all based on their ethnic identity, wherever they may have been from. They also started to create mutual aid societies. Now think of these like neighborhoods. These ethnic neighborhoods would get together and they'd put money into a big pot, and then if somebody got injured on the job, they would take some of that money out to help fund their livelihood. Or if somebody needed medical bills paid, or somebody needed money for this, it was a way to be able to support each other within a specific community. By the year 1900, 90% of blacks still lived in the South. They were down there working. There were a lot that had moved to bigger cities in the South and a lot that had moved north, but predominantly the majority of these freed slaves from 30 years before, 35 years before, still lived in the South. The blacks in the North, though, many of them worked in the service sector, so as butlers or nannies or waiters or those type of things, and a lot of that had to do with the racism that they were experiencing. That top picture up there is a map of New York City, and based on the different color would be a different ethnicity that would be there. And below that map, we can see a picture of Ellis Island and the immigration processing station. And then we can see a picture of a tenement over there on that side. And the rough lifestyles and rough experiences that they were living in these filthy, dirty, cramped areas. Sometimes these tenements would have 20 or more families in very cramped quarters with not good air flow, circulation, and it was very dangerous. Now, what was life like in the cities? Well, you had vaudeville theater, which would have musical acts and skits and magic, and people would go and enjoy these. You had Nickelodeons, which were basically nickel entry movies, short films that you could go into, pay a nickel, and be able to watch. In New York City, they created Coney Island, and Coney Island is an amusement park, roller coasters and rides and different things like that. You also had music. You had ragtime and blues. Many of these started with black performers and became very, very popular despite this idea of still racism and segregation in the country. The phonograph was a very important invention that helped with this. They were able to record the music and be able to play it back. One of the famous ragtime musicians is Scott Joplin. Maybe you've heard his song The Entertainer before, played on the piano. You also had people that were known as guardians of morality. They were there to protect the moral cultures of society. They felt that these dance halls, there were a lot of dance halls, think of them like modern day clubs, that the things that were going on in these clubs were very sexual and very inappropriate for the time. One of the dance moves at that time was something called the bunny hug. And people would go out and say, no, 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 you can't do that, trying to protect people's morality. The term gold digger started in this time period. It's not a modern term. It's a term that's been around for a long time, but basically what it sounds like, a woman going after a man's money. And the ideas of dating started to change. You now had opportunities to go out and date. You didn't have to date with your family and those. You also had the rich people, the robber barons and other people that were financially well off, who had this high culture, high status in life, and wanted to do rich people things, so to say. So they had art museums and different types of museums. They had libraries. Carnegie donated millions and millions of dollars for libraries. They had the symphonies, all these fancy things that these well-to-do people would go and participate in. You also had William Pulitzer William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, who have this idea of yellow journalism. It's this idea of exaggerating things that are happening in order to get sales. So they say, somebody caught a 12-inch shark. So with that 12-inch shark, the media would present it to be a 12-foot shark. They would blow it out of proportion with, celebrity news, kind of like modern times or whatever, but the yellow journalism was huge for them and made them a lot of money. You also had these people called muck rakers. They were journalists who went out and mucked. They raked up the bad things. They exposed bad things that were going on in America, and then they were known as researching for the negative side of American life. So here you can see Coney Island, you can see vaudeville, you can see Scott Joplin, you can see those nickel shows. Here you can see one of those libraries up in that top corner. There you have William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer in the bottom. And then up top you have muckrakers with the meat scandal. And we'll talk more about that meat scandal here in just a second. Now in the cities you had a lot of corruption. You had a lot of things that were not going well. Politicians were being bribed. There were deals going on that were making people a lot of money. This idea of corruption was not new. It's been around forever, but there were some people that really started to focus in on it and do very well with power and finances in results to that. During this time, there also was what's known as a private city, where the private enterprise, private businesses would go out and they would get the jobs for roads and buildings and all these different things, and they were very profit-seeking businesses and were making a lot of money based off this. Political machines were very influential as well. Local party bureaucracies that kept an unshakable grip on both elected and appointed public offices would be a definition of what a political machine is. You had Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. We can see some cartoons representing Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed there. They helped with public service and utilities. If somebody wanted votes, they would pay people to vote for them. If they would go out and get a tip about a land deal that was going to go down and buy the land and sell it for more money so that they could make money. By the 1890s, though, unemployment was at 25%. There was massive unemployment and lower wages. And so there was a big influx of unions. These are organizations that help workers and political parties. One of these is the People's Party that you can see there, and their main focus was stronger government support. So when we're out of work, when things are rough, the government is there to help us. Local government started to oust the machine governments, the county commissions and the city council, those types of things, and they started to introduce reform programs, and they started to introduce parks and pools and concert and lower fares on trolleys and medical care and housing and reduce crime. Try to make life better for us as the individual citizens. Now, there was like we mentioned earlier with the muckrakers. There were people that were fighting against dirt and vice and bad things. The newspaper started to print about corrupt city governments and how large companies were abusing their powers and what the threats were to public health. And so you had a man by the name of Jacob Riis. Here's two pictures of his down here at the bottom. He would go and take photographs and then publish them in a book called How the Other Half Lives in 1890. And it was to show those high society people what their workers were living like, what truly conditions were for the lower socioeconomic people in society and just how bad it was. They also would talk about some of the big city problems, specifically diseases and people dying and death rates and infant mortality rates and all these things and what they could do to fix them. So they started to provide clean water. They started to have piping to bring water into homes that was clean. They started to set up sewer and drainage systems. They started to set limits and laws on pollution. They started to encourage garbage pickup. Simple things that you and I take for granted today, they started to implement and deal with in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They also did something known as the City Beautiful movement, which was striving to have parks and different things and overall make city life even better. They also had a campaign against urban prostitution, red light districts and different things, and stop the abuse and the issues that are going on with prostitution. Now, there were these things called social settlements. One of the most famous ones is called the Hull House. It was created by a woman by the name of Jane Addams. And what it did is it basically provided resources for needy people, families, individuals. Think of it kind of like a modern day rec center. Where they could go and they could clean up. There'd be playgrounds and kindergartens and daycares and libraries and gyms and banks and co-op kitchens and medicine services. All these things would be in one shop, trying to make life better for everyone. Jane Addams said it's an experimental effort to aid in the solution of the social and industrial problems which are engendered by the modern condition of life in a great city. And from this, you started to get people who classified themselves as social workers. They said we're professional caseworkers who served as advocates of social justice. We are out there trying to make life better for these people and provide them the necessary resources to be able to survive and have that American dream. Now, politics started to change a little bit. You had Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book called The Jungle, which ultimately was exposing just how poor the meatpacking industries were in America. And in response to that, he got the Pure Food and Drug Act passed. Women's Trade Union League was created, and they started to train women specifically, but overall leaders, to organize unions in cities to fight for better wages, safer working conditions, and shorter hours. And the reason you had strong unions because of events like this with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, March 25th, 1911. 146 young women died. The average age of these young women and immigrants was 19. There was a fire that started in their factory. They were a few floors up. They attempted to go out the fire escape. The door was locked. They couldn't go out this way because of this. And there were all sorts of issues. And what's interesting is they actually had striked 1 year before for safer working conditions, and then 146 of them ended up dying. Party machines were not enough to fix the problem. People realized, these political machines, these bosses, they're fine, but we need more. So the federal and the state governments starting to get more involved and being able to implement more change so that these meatpacking industry and these young girls who are dying in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, their lives did not need to end unnecessarily.